Hello everyone, my name is Mary Irvin and I am a member of the ITA education team. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this month's webinar where we will discuss what doping is. Thank you for joining us wherever you are in the world. And before we start, please allow me to do some housekeeping. We are delivering this webinar in 5 languages. On your Zoom menu, you will see a button called Interpretation, and by clicking on this icon, you can select a channel with your preferred language. I will be presenting this session in English, but you can also listen in Arabic, French, Russian, or Spanish. Now, today's webinar is part of our educational monthly series that are publicly available and designed to tackle key anti-doping topics and to raise clean sport awareness. Now, as with all of our sessions, it goes without saying that we encourage debate, interaction and questions, but we do not tolerate any kind of aggressive behaviour or abusive or racist language. We trust you will all join us in this spirit of fairness, respect and integrity. Some other housekeeping points. Please do use the chat function to tell us the sport you are representing or where you are in the world. I can see so many of you already doing that even before we came on camera. So it's great to see so many countries represented. I won't be able to name them all, but I can see we have people joining us from Malaysia, Italy, Japan, Sweden, Hungary, Nepal, and Australia, just to name a few. Also, a reminder that you can use the Q&A function to ask us a question during the session, and we will leave some time at the end of these. Finally, note that we record all our webinars so we can make them available on our website and YouTube channel for those who are unable to join this session live. As always, it's my pleasure to give a shout out to our official presenting partner, Inform Sport. Their investment allows us to deliver this webinar programme in the 5 different languages. Now, Informed Sport is a global certification programme for supplements that batch test products for substances prohibited in sport. As supplements contamination continues to be one of the leading causes of inadvertent doping, we encourage athletes and their support personnel to check all products before use at sport.wetestYoutrust.com. We are also proud to be recognised by UNESCO as a leading international organisation for the delivery of anti-doping programmes. And this webinar is delivered with the support of the UNESCO International Convention Against Doping in Sport. So what is this webinar about today? Well, we often find that when we ask the question, what is doping? The response is often testing positive for a banned substance. Now, while this counts for the majority of doping cases, there are 10 additional conducts that could be considered as doping, or in other words, an anti-doping rule violation, as outlined in the World Anti-Doping Code. As such, it's really important that athletes and their entourage understand what each of them are and how they apply to them. Now, we know that legal language can be daunting, and so the purpose of today's session is to look at each of these rules in turn, raise awareness about the legal language, and provide examples of each one. So I would like to welcome today's panellist and invite Aisha Talpaid to turn on her camera, and we offer her a very warm welcome. Aisha is my colleague at the ITA and is a senior legal counsel in the ITA legal team. Now, she has been with the ITA for 5 years, so pretty much since its conception. She is a qualified lawyer from India, and prior to working at the ITA, she worked in sports law in a private practice. Now, as part of the ITA legal team, she oversees the results management and prosecution of anti-doping rule violations from the initial review stage through to the appeal phase before the Court of Arbitration for Sport, or CAS. Now, Aisha and her team have managed more than 1,000 potential anti-doping rule violations at the ITA, so I can think of no better person to join me to discuss our topic today. Big welcome to you, Aisha. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Mary. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and I look forward to discussing this topic with you all.
Thanks so much, Aisha. And just on that note, as we have Aisha with us today, a reminder that we will leave some time at the end of the session for your questions. So please do write them in the Q&A function at any time during the webinar. Now, you will understand that we won't be able to answer specific case examples, but we are happy to address any general legal anti-doping questions. Now, as well as the Q&A, we will also be doing some poll questions today as well. These are all anonymous, so we hope you all join in, give the answer a go, even if you are not certain. So as a warm-up then, let's go straight to our first poll question of the day, and that's going to appear on your screens in just a moment. And the question is, thinking of the 11 anti-doping rule violations, select all the statements that are true. So we have 5 different things here. First up, a sports administrator can be liable for a doping violation. Or coaches do not need to understand doping violations that are applicable only to athletes. Then we have 9 of the 11 doping rules are applicable to athlete support personnel. A coach can be prosecuted for testing positive. And finally, 4 are applicable to athletes only. So I can see that your votes are coming in. Thank you for taking part. We do have an overwhelming favourite for the time being, and that is the first one, with over 50% of you choosing that one. A sports administrator can be liable for a doping violation. I will just pause for another few seconds to allow a few more people to vote before we close up. Okay, let's close the poll and take a look at the answers. And that has stayed pretty steady, with just over half of you choosing the top one, and that one is indeed correct. Coaches do have a responsibility to know all the doping violations, even if they don't apply directly to them. 7 of these rules are applicable to coaches and other people working in sport. The next one up, only athletes can test positive. And the last one, all 11 anti-doping rule violations are applicable to athletes. Okay, so we've set the scene a little bit there. Let's take a look now at the 11 anti-doping rule violations. And we've popped an overview of these up on your screen for you. Now, before we get into the details and the rules, we're going to tackle these one by one with Aisha. We do want to specify that today's webinar is not binding legal or professional advice. If you are notified or feel you may have committed an anti-doping rule violation, please do consult a legal professional who can give advice specifically to your situation. So back to the rules on the screen. Now, the first 4 here, presence, use, evasion, refusal, and whereabouts failures, apply to athletes only. And rules 5 through 11 apply to both athletes and athlete support personnel, such as doctors, coaches, and administrators. Now, to help understand them, we'll go through them one by one and ask ourselves some questions. For example, if we look at Rule 3, we'll look at what are some examples of evading or refusing doping control. Similarly, if we take Rule 5, what are some of the things that can constitute tampering? So let's move on to the first one. Aisha, what can you tell us about anti-doping rule violation 2.1?
Thank you, Mary. So let's get right into it. Article 2.1, presence of a prohibited substance, its metabolite or markers, or simply put, a positive test. This is, as Mary mentioned, this is the rule that is generally most commonly associated with a doping violation, and rightly so, because it is, of course, the most common anti-doping rule violation that is discovered.
Thanks, Aisha. Now, let's go straight into another poll, just to put this one in context, I think, because it is the most common one. But let's ask the audience what percentage of cases they think are for this particular anti-doping rule violation. So please choose. Do you think it's 11% of cases, 43, 65%, 80%, or 93%? So the answers are coming in through much quicker for this one. It's pretty straightforward in terms of single answer compared to the first poll question that we did. And already more than 40% of our audience have given this one a go. So I'll just wait another few seconds. We can see that this answer here is much more level in terms of percentages. So let's close up the poll here, share the screen, and then maybe let's discuss the results. So Aisha, this one has been trickier actually, although the question itself is more straightforward. We have quite a mixed bag of answers here. Could you tell us about the correct one?
Of course. So as of today and in our experience, what we see is close to 80% of all anti-doping rule violations are present. That being said, now that we have many non-analytical anti-doping rule violations, which would be discussed today, we are seeing more and more of the other violations increasing. So today it's 80%, but maybe if we were to have this discussion a few years later, I could predict this number going down quite significantly.
Thanks, Aisha. And we are going to look at 2.1 to start with. It's important that we cover all 11. But as we said, it is also the one that's most commonly thought of as well. So we're going to give pretty even allocation to all 11 rules as we go through this hour's session. So let's have a think. Can you tell us a little bit more about 2.1? What would athletes need to know in particular?
So let me start with what is prohibited and what do we think athletes should know. Simply put, everything on the WADA prohibited list is prohibited. The prohibited list has categorized various banned substances into various categories. Those are categories S1 to S9. I would not go through all of them today, but just a few tips and tricks. Keep a watch out for the prohibited list, which is updated every year. The date you should keep in mind is 1st October, when the new list for the next year is released, which is in effect from 1st January of the next year. There are some substances which are banned only in certain sports. For example, you have something called beta blockers, which are banned in sports like archery, shooting, and golf. But in general, whatever is on that prohibited list is banned for all athletes. The list does specify that certain substances are banned only in competition. For example, that would be stimulants or the use of cannabis. But most other substances are prohibited at all times. So as long as you're an athlete, you cannot use these prohibited substances. I think what's very important to say that most substances are what we called non-threshold substances. That means that no matter how much of the substance is detected in your sample, may it be a few picograms or many, many micrograms, as long as it is discovered, it would be a potential anti-doping rule violation. Mary, to you now.
Thanks, Aisha. Yeah, so let's move straight on to examining that a little bit more. You mentioned, Aisha, there that, you know, many substances there, it doesn't matter even if it's a tiny amount that's found in the athlete's body. So that leads us to discuss something called the principle of strict liability, which is, again, probably one of the most well-known things in anti-doping.
Yes, strict liability principle, and it's on your screen for everyone to read. And I really, really do encourage you to read those few words. No matter how the substance got into your body, the athlete would be liable and is strictly liable for the presence of the prohibited substance. And of course, the only valid justification is if you have a medical exemption or a therapeutic use exemption. From the perspective of an anti-doping organization, the ADO, as we are called, does not need to show that the athlete had intent, or the athlete was negligent, or the athlete knowingly used the prohibited substance for the ADRV to be established. Once the ADRV for presence is established, then it is up to the athlete to explain, or rather to conclusively explain, that it was a particular supplement, medication, or any other product that he used did in fact contain a prohibited substance. This is what we called source. So once the ADRV has been established, which it is by the strict liability principle, then an athlete needs to explain how did it get into your body.
And linking in with that, Aisha, can you give a few examples maybe of what would not be accepted as a defense in this situation?
Well, I wish I could give you a black and white answer, but I'm afraid I cannot. ADRVs, not only presence, but all of them are very fact specific. But however, in general, blaming a third party or saying, I don't know how it got into my body, would not be sufficient. So therefore, if you're an athlete and you said, well, my coach gave it to me, my doctor gave it to me, somebody else from the team gave it to me, or this substance would never have increased my performance, or I didn't intend to use it, or I didn't know it was banned, without getting into specific circumstances and specific explanations, these, very generally speaking, would not be an acceptable defense to completely exonerate an athlete under the WADA code.
Thanks, Aisha. And I think we can't underestimate the importance of this one in athletes and their support personnel, understanding their rights and responsibilities and understanding how to check their medications, for example. So once this webinar ends, everybody, as I mentioned earlier, will receive all of these slides. We also include one of the slides with lots of resources on it, with links where you can click to either watch webinars giving you more precise information on some of these rights and responsibilities, or e-learning courses or other resources where you can find out more. Okay, let's take a look at 2.2. This is the use or attempted use of a prohibited substance or method. And this one is related to the first one, right, Aisha?
Yes, absolutely. And the big difference between a 2.1, which is presence, and 2.2 use, is that use can be established by a whole range of things. So by any reliable means, such as an admission of an athlete saying, I used it, or by witness statements, by documentary evidence, but also by any other analytical information, such as data that is derived from the athlete biological passport. And we did speak about, talking about use or attempted use, it's important to know that it's both use of a prohibited substance as well as use of a prohibited method. So while many athletes are used to what is a prohibited substance, I do want to spend a minute on talking about what are prohibited methods. And just to give a few examples, this would include sample substitution, which is asking someone else to provide a sample on your behalf. It would include blood transfusions. It would include gene doping. So similar to the prohibited list, where the prohibited substances are detailed, even what are the prohibited methods, that M1, M2, and M3 is very much detailed in the WADA prohibited list. So I very much urge you to have a look at it so that you can ensure that what you are doing is not a prohibited method.
Thanks, Aisha. We can look at 2.3 now as well. Again, this is the third of the 4 rules that are applicable to athletes only. This one now relates to the sample collection, and that is evading, refusing, or failing to submit to sample collection once an athlete has been notified by an authorized person. So what should athletes in particular need to know here?
First and foremost, what is important for athletes to know is that you can be tested at any time, anywhere, by either your international federation, your national anti-doping organization, and in some extent by major event organizers. You are not only for athletes in the registered testing pool, which we will discuss in a minute. You're not only going to be tested during that particular 1 hour of the day. You can be tested at any time. And the minute you are notified, the obligation on the athlete is to submit to testing and to provide the sample then and there. You cannot evade or refuse to provide a sample unless, and what the code says, unless there are compelling justifications. I'm sure the question is going to be, what are compelling justifications? And I must say, this is ultimately for a tribunal or for the CAS to decide. But the general rule that you should keep in mind is that if it is physically, hygienically, and morally possible to give the sample, then the sample needs to be provided.
Thanks, Aisha. So in other words, the sense I'm getting from you there is best to take the test. Generally, and any concerns can also be noted on the doping control form that all athletes need to check and sign at the end of the process. But if we again maybe sort of think practically, maybe you can give us some examples again of what would not be an acceptable defense here in terms of evading or refusing to submit to sample collection.
Best to take the test indeed. And I think this could be the new slogan. But very much, if you have any concerns about the test, you are doubting the accreditation of the doping control officer, or you're not sure you need to give it, there you are given space in the doping control form. Very much feel free, either as an athlete or as an administrator who has concerns, to report any worries that you may have. But it is indeed very much best to take the test. Talking about compelling justifications, The WADA has provided guidelines on the results management standard, and it has given a few examples of what has not been considered as compelling justifications. So keep these in mind during your test. So you can't say, I had to go to church, I had to go to school, I did not know that the person was the DCO, I have another event to attend. My coach told me not to give the sample. My manager told me not to give the sample. I can't do it now, but I will do it later in the day. These, generally speaking, and the WADA guidelines have specified, are not compelling justifications. 2.3 very often is an avoidable anti-doping rule violation if athletes just adhere to their duty to provide a sample immediately upon notification by a doping control officer.
Thanks, Aisha, and I'm seeing already some questions coming through that we'll tackle at the end. But it's great to see questions, sort of are then related to some of the things that we're talking about as we go through. So 2.4, whereabouts failures. Now, this is for a very specific set of athletes as well, but it's still important that all athletes understand the principle behind here. So what's this one all about?
2.4, whereabout failures, or the 3 strikes and you're out rule. So what is this? I think it's important. This is applicable to athletes who are in the registered testing pool. You can be in the registered testing pool of either your international federation or your national anti-doping organization. If you have a doubt, I very much encourage you to ask them. So athletes who are in a registered testing pool, if you have any combination of 3 missed tests or 3 filing failures within a 12-month period, that constitutes an anti-doping rule violation. The obligation on these athletes is to provide complete and accurate whereabout information. And once again, I must emphasize that testing is always without notice. You're not going to get a call where someone tells you, as an RTP athlete, you will be tested in 2 days, come to this particular place. You can be tested at any time, and not only during your 1-hour time slot. But I know Mary would give you more information on whereabout failures in just a minute.
Thanks, Aisha. Yes, we're gonna tackle this over the full hour in our next monthly webinar that's scheduled for the last week of August. So if you are listening and you are in a registered testing pool and you'd like to do scenarios specific to this example and also learn more tips, then please do join us. Registrations will open in a week or so, and please do follow us on social so that you are the first to hear when you can register for that one. So that summarizes and sums up really the first 4 anti-doping rule violations. Again, just emphasizing that these are applicable to athletes only, but it's important that everyone involved in the sport does understand them so they can also help their athletes and guide them through those. The next lot that we are going to tackle are applicable then to athletes and their athlete support personnel. And the first one here, 2.5, that is tampering with any part of the doping control process. Now, before we go back to Aisha to ask her for some practical advice on this one, let's look at a case scenario, and we're also going to run a poll question in conjunction with it. So we're going to consider a scenario. I'd like you to consider all the details around about this and select what you think could be the correct answer. So the scenario is, I was at a party last night and people around me were smoking marijuana. I have finished my event and have been notified for testing. I'm worried about a positive test, so consider knocking my sample to the floor. Please choose what you think is the correct answer here. This is considered evasion only. This is considered tampering only. Could this be considered evasion and tampering? Is it considered an accident? Or is it simply, I didn't ingest the substance, and so I am not responsible for a positive test? So thanks for selecting what you think is the appropriate ones here. Just thinking again about the first three choices. So evasion, that goes back to when we were looking at 2.3. Tampering, the one that we're looking at now, relating to anti-doping rule violation 2.5. And then evasion and tampering, we're considering two anti-doping rule violations together here. Or was it an accident? Or simply you didn't ingest the substance, so therefore you are not responsible. So that's great. I can see more than 60% of you have already participated. So maybe we could close this one up and have a look at the answer. Now, Aisha, I'm going to ask you just to run this through for us, but we can see 60% of people have chosen option 3. Do you agree with them?
I do, and I'm very happy to see the poll where so many of you got the correct answer. So if this particular person were to go ahead with knocking your sample to the floor, depending on the circumstances, it could very much potentially be evasion and tampering. And that is the thing with anti-doping rule violations. Your conduct could actually be more than one anti-doping rule violation for the same conduct. So I'm happy to know that so many of you got it correct.
Thanks, Aisha. Yes, I agree. Great to see. Maybe a little note on this one before we move on, looking at the definition of tampering again. But this particular substance that we chose here, marijuana or cannabis, is prohibited during the in-competition periods. So in this particular situation, the athlete had finished their event and was already in the out of competition period. So the finding of cannabis wouldn't have been an issue and would not have resulted in a positive test in this particular situation. So in knocking the sample to the floor, the athlete could be risking a period of ineligibility for a substance that wasn't prohibited at the time it was potentially ingested. Okay, let's take a look then at the definition of tampering again, and let's think about some further context to this one. So there we gave the example of both tampering and evasion, Aisha, but specifically concentrating on tampering now. What should our listeners know here?
Once again, this is like a 2.3, a very avoidable anti-doping rule violation, as long as you understand what conduct constitutes tampering. But just going back a few spaces, what is tampering? So tampering, and this would be a bit of legalese, but it is an intentional conduct which subverts the doping control process. And the WADA code defines a doping control very widely. That means, technically speaking, you may commit a tampering violation at any time. So during sample collection, during testing, when you are providing your whereabouts, when you're applying for a TUE, during results management. So right from the time of the start to the finish of anti-doping, this violation can be committed. Therefore, it's important to know what is tampering. The examples I will give are just illustrative. I am not covering each and every possible conduct that may be tampering. So just take these as a few examples. And a lot of guidance is given by the VADA code on what are these examples. So getting into it. Some are quite obvious. If you offer or you accept a bribe, either to a DCO or to any other official. Very, very importantly, if you submit forged or falsified documents, fake medical certificates, fake information, either during the results management process or during your TUE application process. If you give false statements, false evidence, or false documents during an anti-doping investigation. But also, if you ask someone to lie to you, lie for you on your behalf, if you intimidate a witness who wants to go ahead and give a statement, if you break a bottle at the time of sample collection, if you add a foreign substance to your sample in order to adulterate it, or you add water to dilute it. So a whole host of conduct can constitute as a tampering violation.
Thanks, Aisha. It's great to hear some examples there, and I know that doesn't cover everything, but it's nice to give a flavour so the athletes and athlete support personnel can begin to get an idea. Again, as we talked about, like looking at what the legal language means, sort of in practice. Now, with the next lot of anti-doping rule violations, we've grouped the next three together. So we're going to have a look at 2.6 through to 2.8 in a group, essentially. And they are, first up, 2.6, possession of a prohibited substance or method. Then 2.7, trafficking or attempted trafficking of a prohibited substance or method. And then 2.8, administration or attempted administration of a prohibited substance or method. Now, I think it's really helpful and interesting to have a look at case studies. So again, bringing them to life and getting you, the audience, interacting with us. So we're going to launch straight into another case study here. And this one that I was particularly interested in was around 2.6, and that was possessing a prohibited substance. Because this rule, as we've talked about, applies to athlete support personnel as well as athletes. So how would athlete support personnel, for example, protect themselves if they need to use a prohibited substance for a legitimate medical requirement? So let's have a go at this one now. The case scenario in here is the poll on your screen now as well. And the situation is this. I am a coach and require a medication on the prohibited list for my personal medical condition. What do I need to do to protect myself from an anti-doping rule violation? Select the ones that you think are correct here. Is it ask your doctor for a different medication that does not contain prohibited substances? Is it apply for a therapeutic use exemption just as an athlete would? Is it always carry your prescription alongside the medication? Or is it nothing? Because possession by a coach must also be in connection with an athlete. So thank you for giving this one a go. This is interesting as well. The answers that are coming in are much more level compared to the last one. It's almost an equal distribution so far in terms of answers here. And we're already up. I can see more than 50% of you have taken part. So I'll just pause for a moment, and then I suggest that in a couple of seconds, we close up the poll, have a look at the range of answers, and ask Aisha what she thinks. So let's close up. Now, very, very close here. Most popular answer just here is to apply for a therapeutic use exemption, closely followed by carrying your prescription. Aisha, what's the situation here, please?
Well, The answer, or rather, the answer is given in the code itself. And for once, I would draw your attention to a particular article in the code, and that's Article 2.6.2, which very much does clarify that possession by a coach of a prohibited substance must be in connection with an athlete, competition, or training for it to constitute an anti-doping rule violation for possession. So, although technically possession by a coach for personal use may not generally constitute an anti-doping rule violation, there are two caveats to it. We would still always advise the coach, if indeed you are using a prohibited substance for a medical reason, carry with you your prescriptions at all times. And the second would be, try not to keep it on you during an in-competition period. Try not to keep it in a locker room, in an athlete's gym bag, or anything that might, be interpreted to be in connection with an athlete training or competition. However, if you are using it for medical reasons in your own bedroom, it should not be an anti-doping rule violation.
Great, thank you, Aisha. I don't know if you want to just touch upon quickly some of the justifications for an athlete support personnel carrying it for athletes.
Yes. Again, very important for all coaches and doctors to know. Of course, if it's the code, and I know I always keep a copy of the code with me. I know you can't see it, but the answer to everything is really in the code. And the code is taking into consideration these very practical situations, and they carve out what they call acceptable justifications. So if you are a doctor and you're carrying medication that is very strictly needed to treat acute and emergency situations, you may keep that with you, even if it is in connection with an athlete, competition, or training. And I cannot caveat most of my sentences enough to say eventually a decision is to be taken by a tribunal, but a good example of this is if a doctor is carrying an EpiPen. So it's an injection that's given for acute allergies. But if as a doctor, you're keeping it for just as safekeeping to treat an athlete in an urgent medical situation, for the doctor, it should not be considered as a possession violation. And I am cognizant of the time, but I did want to spend a couple of minutes emphasizing this point.
Thanks, Aisha. Yes, we'll cover some of the other anti-doping rule violations pretty quickly, I think. But maybe just before we move on to the next one, this situation, if we replace the word coach with athlete, it would be a different situation, correct?
It would indeed be a different situation. So even in this example, if you are an athlete and you require a medication on the prohibited list, the answer is you need to apply for a medical exemption or a therapeutic use exemption before using the medication. So we urge you apply for your TUEs sufficiently in advance to avoid anti-doping rule violations.
Fabulous, thank you. So let's take a look back at the definitions of 2.6 to 2.8, and maybe Aisha, you could touch upon 2.7 and 2.8 before we move on.
Yes, and I'll be quite quick about trafficking or administration violations. So just hear me out. So what do you need to know about trafficking? The WADA code prohibits selling, giving, transporting, delivering, or distributing a prohibited substance or a prohibited method. Similar to a possession violation, if you are a medical professional and you are keeping the medication or you're giving it to an athlete for a genuine legal therapeutic purpose, it's not going to be considered as trafficking. So we don't want the takeaway of all our doctors who are watching the webinar to feel that if you give medication to athletes, you're going to have anti-doping organizations come after you for trafficking. That is not the case. So moving on to administration. So what is that? It applies if you provide, you supply, you facilitate, or you participate in the use or the attempted use of a prohibited substance. I do admit that legal professionals like to use many words in definitions, but it does come in handy when we are looking at various situations. You don't need to personally provide the prohibited substance to an athlete to commit this violation. And bear that in mind. As an athlete support personnel, if you've orchestrated or encouraged or assisted athletes to take a prohibited substance, it may still amount to administration.
Great, thank you, Aisha. I think what I'm going to do now is we did have another case scenario to go through relating back to 2.6 and 2.7, but I think we've discussed that pretty well and covered some good practical examples already. So I'd like to move straight on to complicity, please. And that is the 9th one. So complicity or attempted complicity in an anti-doping rule violation. So what do we need to know here, Aisha? Apologies for jumping ahead.
No worries. So just give me a second, of course. So talking about complicity, if you are aware that someone intends or attempts to violate an anti-doping rule, and if you try to cover up someone else's anti-doping rule violation, you can be sanctioned for complicit behavior. And let me explain, or rather let the code explain. The code explains that complicit behavior includes assisting, encouraging, aiding, abetting, conspiring, or covering up an ADRV. Very often, complicity can be committed along with other ADRVs, and I'll just give you a few examples. So if you were to encourage an athlete not to provide a sample, it would be complicity. If you as an athlete support personnel destroyed a sample once or before it was collected, it could be both tampering as well as complicity. Again, if you tried to bribe a DCO, it could be both tampering and complicity. And very often you may be charged with both depending on the facts and circumstances of that particular case.
Thanks, Aisha. And we can move straight on to 2.10 now, which is prohibited association by an athlete or other person. So this relates to interactions with someone sanctioned for doping. Is that correct? And what does that actually mean?
Yes, that is correct. So athletes and athlete support personnel are not allowed to work with any, in a sports or professional capacity with any person who you know is serving a sanction for a doping violation. And once again, the code gives us guidance of a few examples that would be covered by this anti-doping rule violation. So you cannot receive coaching, obtain training, strategy, technique, nutrition, or medical advice. You cannot allow that person, that sanctioned person, to be your agent or your representative. And it's really important to know that WADA publishes a global list of athlete support personnel who are currently suspended from working with athletes or who are currently sanctioned. So if you have a doubt, I encourage you to look at this list where, to the extent possible, all the ASPs who are currently sanctioned would be on that list. So if you want to avoid a 2-point violation, we urge you to very much look at that list. Last thing is, please be aware that even if you receive free coaching from a sanctioned person, it would still be hit by 210. So a monetary transaction is not necessary at all.
Thanks, Aisha. I think we should do the next case study, though, and put what we've just heard into practice by doing a case study and we have a poll question associated with this as well. So this is the situation that we have thought of, and it is this. My best friend was sanctioned due to a medication they should have had a therapeutic use exemption in place for. They are devastated as they did not fully understand the rules. As a friend and athlete, what can or can't I do under the anti-doping rules during the period of their sanction? So let's launch the poll, and I'd like to hear what people think of this one. You can choose. I can train with them as usual. I can use training facilities at the same time as long as they are not directly part of my training session. I can go for a run with them in a park. I can meet them for dinner, or I can provide them with coaching advice. So 5 answers to choose from. Thank you for giving this one a go. Again, we have a couple of answers that are the clear favorites here. And maybe as people are still voting, Aisha, again, I'm thinking of the time here, perhaps you could already talk us through this one.
Yeah, so we just heard a bit about prohibited association, and I'd repeat the elements. So if you're aware that someone is sanctioned, you cannot be associated with them in any professional or sports-related capacity. These are for 2 reasons, because if the sanctioned person is training or using the facilities, and we would discuss this in a minute, it would be a violation of that person's period of ineligibility. So the safest answer out here, and to avoid any doubt or any room for interpretation, the safest answer, I would not call it the correct answer, would be meet them for dinner. Whatever you do in your personal life, as long as it's not associated in a sports-related or a professional capacity, would not be prohibited.
Thanks, Aisha. And let's look at the final one, and it's also the most recent. Can you tell us a bit about this one?
Final one, and I'll go through that quite quickly. So what does Article 211 say? It is preventing, or rather it's encouraging people to come forward and report any violation of anti-doping rules that you're seeing. And we tell athletes, we tell coaches, you are our eyes and ears on the field on what is actually happening. So if someone is discouraging you or threatening you or is stopping you from reporting this, it would be considered as an anti-doping rule violation against that individual. Of course, I need to mention Article 211 is very new, so I cannot come up with many innovative examples to explain the various situations. But in general, if someone threatens, intimidates, or discourages you from reporting to authorities, it would be an anti-doping rule violation.
Lovely, thank you. We've got a couple more things to go through before we move to the Q&A. But I know you were keen also to talk about the violation of the period of ineligibility. It's important for athletes to understand this one as well. So perhaps you could give us some thoughts on that.
Very much so, and I'll be quite quick. And very non-officially, this is the 12th anti-doping rule violation, or rather violation of your period of ineligibility. So what should athletes know? If you have been sanctioned by an ADO, then during the period of ineligibility, you cannot. And there's a long list of things you cannot do. You cannot participate in competitions, either at the national or the international level in any sport. You cannot participate in training camps organized by the National Federation or by your club, as long as it is funded by a government. But you also cannot participate in any administrative activities, like you cannot serve as an official, a director, an employee of these organizations. And not only when you're sanctioned, this also applies to athletes when they are provisionally suspended. And if you were to violate this period of ineligibility, you risk a new period of ineligibility, which is equal in length to your original period of ineligibility. So once again, an avoidable anti-doping rule violation.
Thanks, Aisha. And we have both a summary slide and also a resources slide that I mentioned. So there's no need for me to talk through those ones. The purpose of these two slides are for you all to receive this information by email when the webinar ends. So you can do some extra reading on any of these areas should you wish. So I'm pleased now to say that we can try and tackle a few of the questions. Thanks for those that have come through. The first one, Aisha, is does it depend on the quantity and the nature of the substance? Now, I think this relates back to when we were talking about the threshold limit under 2.1.
Yes.
Anything to quickly mention there?
Yes. So there are some substances that have a threshold limit, and the WADA prohibited list very much details it. But majority of substances are non-threshold. So no, quantity does not matter if it is a non-threshold substance, whether it's trace amount, large amounts, whatever it is. If it's non-threshold, if it is found in your body, it would be a potential 2.1 ADRV.
Thanks, Aisha. And maybe if I group the next two together, because one is what happens if the athlete has a phobia of needles, if they are notified of a blood test? What would happen if the athlete was drugged by another person, for example, in a bar? Will the athlete be banned? So again, here we're talking about two very specific scenarios. Is there anything you can generalize there?
Phobia of needles, I don't have an easy answer for that, but unfortunately, the requirement on athletes to provide a sample is very, very high. And as I said, compelling justifications are for a tribunal to decide. But in my limited experience, unless the phobia is medical and it's impossible, remember the keywords are hygienically, morally, or physically impossible, it's a very, very high standard to meet. So phobia of needles is not going to cut the mustard. I think the next question is, if the athlete was drugged by another person in a bar, will the athlete be banned? I cannot give you a yes or no answer, because if an athlete is claiming sabotage, you need to keep in mind that sabotage is a very, very serious allegation. So if an athlete needs to prove that person has done it, it's a very high burden for an athlete to prove. Depending on the situation, the ban would reflect it accordingly. But no, I can't give you a yes or no answer on that question. So
Thanks.
I think
Yeah.
that's all the time we have. But I
Yes.
know Mary would say all your other questions, please do write to us, and we would be happy to answer them for you.
Yes, absolutely. And I think particularly for the RTP one, where we're tackling that very subject in detail in next month's webinar. So we'd be happy to address that then. But equally, if you don't want to wait till next month's webinar, if you do have any other questions or we haven't managed to address them here, please do drop us a line. We will put our email address up on screens for you in just a moment. So that really wraps up today's webinar. Just leaves me time to say, Aisha, many, many thanks for taking us through all 11 anti-doping rule violations, breaking them down, providing some examples for us. It's been really informative and interesting, and I'm sure our audience enjoyed it as well. And also a massive thanks to you, of course, our audience, for tuning in. And we hope to see you again next month, where we are discussing whereabouts. And in the interim, if you do want to receive updates from the ITA, not just about our webinars, but other things as well, please do sign up to our newsletter using the link or the QR code that you will find on this slide. So thank you all again. Thank you, Aisha, and I
Thank
wish
you.
everybody a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.